We are in Kaplankaya on the southwestern coast of Turkey for our annual gathering Harvest series. Here we bring together some of the greatest minds with expert speakers, renowned practitioners and talented performers, all aimed at creating curiosity, opening our minds and imagining a better future. I hope you'll enjoy this interview. Today, my guest is Jamie Wheal. Jamie is a researcher, speaker, and author specialized in human potential and peak performances. He is the co-founder of the Flow Genome Project, an organization focused on studying and training individuals to achieve optimal states of consciousness and performance. Jamie Wheal has also worked with organizations such as the US Navy, Google, and Red Bull to develop programs. He's the author of the bestseller Stealing Fire and Recapture the Rapture. He's a co-curator with the Harvest of this season 7. He dedicated a lot of time and energy to have a meaningful event about radical hope. Hello, Jamie.
Hi there, Rose. Nice to be back with you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's our second podcast for Harvest series. I'm very happy. Today we'll talk about radical hope, how ancient civilization can inspire us to look for a better future. So we are in the southwestern coast of Turkey and former Anatolia. You co-created this event, the 7th edition, and you really wanted to anchor the event in its fascinating location. Can we start this interview explaining where we are and why it's so inspiring?
Sure. I mean, I think the first thing, and this took several visits for me to come to Kaplankaya, and at first you just sort of feel the built environment, the beautiful hotel, the Six Senses resort, all of the amenities. And then the more that I learned from Burak, the founder and creator of this project, and Roman, his partner on founding Harvest, the more I just became increasingly amazed by how deep the history and the roots of this place actually are. And so for instance, the starting of the opening ceremony, I think maybe last May, included Anatolian folk singers around the fire circle. And they were saying, hey, this is an Anatolian tradition. We are going to play this song, and it is in honor of this rising crescent moon that happens to be coming up over the hill as they were performing it. And I think that was one of the first sort of unlocks. They're like, oh, there's something ancient here. And then we had the opportunity to go mountain biking through the countryside and through the olive groves to end up in Miletus and Didyma with the Colosseum there and also Apollo's temple, and just getting to see that intersection of ancient history and contemporary culture. And then went all the way up to Ephesus, which is, at the time that it was, one thing is I didn't even realize in the New Testament, there's all Paul's letters to the Ephesians. And I remember reading that in school, in fact, having to read it in church because I came to America and I had an English accent. So they put me up in the pulpit to read. And I remember the first letter of Paul to the Ephesians. And then suddenly I'm like, oh, Ephesians are from Ephesus, duh. And Paul was from Tarsus, which is also in Turkey. So you're like, the entire story of the Greek and the classical world that we tend to think of, not surprisingly, as kind of Greece and Italy, actually massively include this entire Aegean coastline of Anatolia. And to realize that so many of the milestones and so many of the touch points of the ancient world, not sort of just touched here incidentally as sort of empires expanded and contracted, but were born here. Really, I found inspiring. And then we were up at the clubhouse in Kaplankaya, the highest building on the property, and there was a sunset cocktail party. And this was, again, I think this was maybe 2 years ago. And Roman was just helpfully pointing out landmarks. And he said, look at that island, two over, way in the distance. That's Patmos. And Patmos is where famously John, not John of the Gospels, but a different John, wrote the book of Revelations. And at the time, we were actually having a conversation here about existential risk, about the state of the world. And I thought, my God, how absolutely apropos. You can't make this up. And then I went for a mountain bike ride with Burak, and he took me up to the high ridge line behind Kaplankaya, where the windmills are that power this property. And then he said, hey, we're up here, look north, and there's Samos. And Samos is where Pythagoras was born, where the entire Pythagorean, the pre-Socratic tradition kicked off. And between all those things, I just thought, dear God, this place is so rich and so steeped in history, and we are finding our way as to the nature of harvest. What is it about? Is it a wellness conference? Is it a big ideas conference? Is it a gathering of people from all around the world? All of these things. And it sort of felt like, yes, it is absolutely all of those things. It's not that we sort of ought to or should pick a lane. This is the simplest, obvious revival of the ancient academy. And most people know that with Plato and Socrates in that era. But the only reason we know about Plato is because Plato wrote and his writings were preserved, and he just told the story of Socrates. Pythagoras, we get the triangles, we get the mathematics, right? And we get even maybe the music of the spheres, but he's more dimly back there in history. But his impact on all of them is profound. And so if you go to Ephesus and you go through the villas of the wealthiest patrons in that city, which was on par with Rome, on par with Alexandria. It was one of the major hubs of Mediterranean civilization. They have these marble basins in the wealthiest, most powerful people's homes. And they were literally the symposies. When you think of symposium, we typically think of like stuffy business conferences. Like, I'm going to a medical symposium, right? It's not that at all. It's like literally means symposies, is to drink together. It's the same root as like potable. And they would have these basins, and everyone would bring their own flask of wine, and then they'd pour it in there and mix it up, and then they'd all get absolutely hammered and discuss philosophy, politics, religion, the issues of the day. And then our guide then showed us behind another door, and there were all of these beautiful mosaics and everything else, and they would host their own Eleusinian mysteries late night. So you're like, wait, these guys are hanging out, they're getting hammered, they're discussing everything, and then they're going and having the after party, right, with the secret chemicals of Kykeon to then shoot the moon, as well as the bathhouses. And the fact that Ephesus, it's the harbor got silted in, and the city was abandoned because they had these fancy ass bathhouses. And they had chopped all the forests down to fuel the furnaces for their steam rooms and hammams and bathing. And here at Kaplankaya, there's 90,000 square foot, the largest spa in Europe. I think that Six Senses,
huge one,
right? With beautiful hammams, with all these things. And so just looking around, you're just like, oh my gosh, it's all here. And then the harvest ideas, the speakers, are literally, the stage is in a grove of olives on the edge of the Aegean, and Academies was the original wealthy landowner that donated his grove of olives to Plato in Athens. So that's how it gets Academy, comes from Academies, the guy who bestowed the original grove of olives for Plato to teach in. So, there are just so many of those tendrils, so many of those stories, and so many of those resonances that rather than sort of trying to find our way forward, who do we want to be when we grew up, or what's the brand of this place, or what is out there in the market. It's it's the sort of socio-psycho archaeology. Just excavate what's here, and let's just double down on that. And isn't it, timely and appropriate and, aesthetically pleasing, right? To just say, hey, let's just reinvigorate, let's just reactivate the Pythagorean academy.
So Jamie, how are you going to revive now during this event the Academy Symposium?
Yeah, I think, again, the answers are sort of there in the text. They're there in our history. So the Academy wasn't just intellectual. There were sort of at least three elements to it, there was the Symposium, which we just discussed. So that was the kind of the battling of ideas, the sharing of intellectual concepts, rhetoric, logic, those sort of ideas. But there was also the gymnasium, right? The idea, very much so, that the notion of wrestling, the notion of fitness, the idea that body and mind were connected, they sort of met with that Greek classical ideal of what it meant, arete, excellence, right? Included physicality, included wrestling, and included all of the things that, you were to think that philosophers might actually be, literally, mixed martial arts, as well as the philosophy. So the idea that body supports mind was another enormous element. And obviously some of the sort of the earliest superstar athletes, like in the Premier League or like in the American NBA or something, existed then.
Okay.
Right. And they preened around and they were followed and they had fans and all that. And that's not necessarily what Pythagoras was doing. His was almost more like a sort of Shaolin temple, right? The idea of like honing and training our physicality sharpens our mind and sharpens our access to the numinous. And then finally, the mysterium. And there were so many mystery schools through ancient Greece, and then borrowed and continued through Rome and to this day. But the Eleusinian mysteries were one of the most well-known and longest lived. But there was the Delphic oracle in Didyma, next to Miletus, right? That's where Alexander the Great rode through on his way to conquer the world. And the oracle told him, you will conquer more than anyone ever has before, but you're going to die young, buddy. And off he went to fulfill history.
Destiny, yeah.
Yeah. And so it's incredibly inspiring, really, especially when you consider the contemporary community of Harvest, which is this wonderfully international gathering, and it sort of spans Eurasia. You have Uzbekis and Kazakhstanis, and you have Muscovites, and you have Ukrainians, and you have folks from places in Estonia. You have, and even Asia. Folks coming from Japan and other places. So you have this kind of wonderful cross-pollination at the intersection of Europe and Asia. Where obviously Istanbul and the Bosporus, have always been that. Right? They've always had waves of different cultures washing over them. Then you have the Western European folks, the sort of Lisbon to Spain, Ibiza, Paris, London, and then you have the North American cohorts and even some South Americans. And the idea that everyone is coming largely informed by contemporary mystery practices. And we'll be having a panel discussion about that on the first day of Harvest this year, which is literally exploring how do these ancient traditions, how have they shown up today? And whether that, one of the most obvious examples is the kind of global Burning Man culture, and Burning Man is a very large festival in the deserts of Utah, of Nevada, but there are also regional versions throughout the Mediterranean, Israel, and in Australia, and all over the place. And that is a distinct undercurrent of who has been having some of these experiences of, the symposium, and whether that's TED conferences or other big idea conferences or Davos or whatever it might be, but they want more and they find it in the rest of their life. And the wellness elements are all obviously essential. And that's like Dr. Mark Hyman and Gabor Mate and some of these other speakers that have come and shared their wisdom here at Harvest, but also the mysterium, and that's the artists and the musicians and the pageantry and even the opening ceremonies and all of these elements and the breath work and all of these components that allow people not just to activate and sort of cogitate and think things, but to actually feel and experience things. And then very much also the spa and the hammams and the ocean. So it's really bringing those all together in a way that feels, novel, but also deeply congruent. And then as you peel back the layers, you realize, oh, wow, this is sort of same as it ever was. This is also just deeply traditional, and there's nothing new under the sun.
So the academies were a bit more local, with local communities. Mm-hmm. What's the challenge with having, like you said, people from all over the world when you give some content and everything?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, obviously one is just simply, there are so many people that, even though they've traveled the world, etc., English isn't their first language. And this is a predominantly English-speaking event. So there is a presumption there that, especially if, and I'm as guilty as anyone of being excited, speaking quickly, using terms that may or may not easily translate. So I think the number one is just the obvious language barriers. And a number of people do their absolute best to keep up, and I would be lost in the dust if anybody else was speaking in non-English terms. So Turkish or even French, which I have had some baseline conversance in. So that would be one. Another would be cultural differences, and what is fundamentally safe, permissible, dignified, fun, edgy. Take a list of any of those things, and every culture sort of draws those boundaries slightly differently.
Yeah.
And how to find fundamentally permission, right? So in some respects, I think the thing that we were looking for is another triplet, which is ecstasis, right? Is the peak experience. of the mysteries. Catharsis would be the deep healing of the gymnasium, the body, and the mending there. And communitas, right, would be the outcome of all of these dialogues and conversations, right? So the promise, or what we would be shooting for, is can we provide ecstasis, the peak states, without the craving, right, or addiction to state seeking? Mm-hmm. Can we provide catharsis without the cringe, right? Without the sense of this is very new agey, this is woo-wooey, this is California, whatever it might be. And can we provide the communitas, right? That deep sense of dropping into something bigger than ourselves together without the cults, without unreliable leaders and followers. And if we can do those three things, then I think the invitation is there for everyone to participate fully. And I think, if I held any hope for what we're doing for this harvest in particular, but I would say from here on out, it would be to help inspire the shift from an audience, people coming to see what they're going to receive, into participants that are coming to co-create something deeply magical together.
The theme of the 6th season was regeneration, and this 7th edition is radical hope. Can you explain the notion of radical hope?
Sure. It's actually, it doesn't just mean super duper hope. It's actually an academic concept. Okay. It comes from Jonathan Lear at the University of Chicago. And he was conducting a study on 19th century American Indian reservation life. Okay. Right. Which was actually, obviously a time of cultural collapse and huge amounts of crisis and despair. And for him, the description of radical hope is belief in a future that you cannot see from here, but commit to believing in nonetheless. And to me, that feels really important, because as everybody who is following the news on any channel at any time these days, there are what many scholars are calling a polycrisis. Right? There's not just one thing happening, like, hey, geopolitics are getting kind of sketchy, Ukraine, Taiwan, what's next, right? It's not just climate, like, oh gosh, all the modeling is actually worse than we thought, and all of those ice sheets are suddenly getting, erased by the tides, and we might have to change all of our models. Or, hey, wait a second, what about, where's all that methane coming from, and it's 80 times worse than CO2, or polar bears sad, or social collapse, and we know the story, right? Yeah. And it's really tricky. And we're privileged to have some of the smartest, most connected people in the world working on this at a policy level, working this at a government and non-governmental levels, all these kinds of things. And, as a group, they're generally not super optimistic. So the people who know the most are the most freaked out, right? Yeah. So the question then is, it's not kind or helpful, I don't think, to disillusion people at a rate faster than they can handle, but it is essential just for mature, engaged citizenship that we do understand the stakes, we do understand the lateness of the hour, we do understand that, the sort of whistling past the graveyard, hopey hope, what some people call hopium, right? That it kind of just numbs you and blisses you out, and like, it's all going to work out. It always works out. We always invent our way out of this, right? Mm-hmm. Those kinds of things simply aren't fit for purpose. They're not fit for this moment in history, but neither is nihilism and despair. And so one way of looking at this is, and this is kind of a Kabbalistic Jewish theological notion, but it's the notion of sort of ensoulment. How do we grow up, basically? So
it implies action, individual actions?
Yeah, and the first level is sort of the pre-tragic, right? Which is, I'm going to grow up to be a millionaire or a president. I'm going to marry Prince Charming or Sleeping Beauty. Everything's going to work out, right? And it's fundamentally kind of an adolescent or juvenile take. But there's an awful lot of marketing that promises that. There's an awful lot of pundits on social media and, America's next top shaman. Everybody is promising, if you just do this, take this pill or this course or this program, everything you've ever wanted is going to be yours. And I think that is, massively it's not reality based, and it's super problematic. But then there's the tragic. So once we move from, I believe everything's going to work out for me, and then I run smack dab into the tragic. It's a loss of loved ones. It's a bankruptcy. It's an illness. It's a dislocation. I'm now suddenly a refugee and I had a life before. What has happened? And then I go into the pit of despair where I believe nothing's going to work out. And that will actually catch and stop an awful lot of people, because there's a lot of tragedy in the world. I mean, the earthquakes here in Turkey, right? No question.
Every day, yeah.
Right? 150 to 250,000 lives lost, 13 million people homeless overnight, right? That is tragic. And then the question is the handful of people that are able to make the transition to the post-tragic. And the post-tragic is where we get to radical hope. The post-tragic is what Mandela and Martin Luther King and Gandhi anchored from, which is we're not sweeping this under the rug, the suffering of our people, the injustice, the imbalances, the enormity of the indignities that we face, but we choose to believe in a future we cannot see from here. So it's ultimately, I believe, it's going to work out, even if it doesn't yet for me. And that brings us into an intergenerational perspective, which many, many cultures have always had, right? Right.
Anyway, it's happening whether you want it or not. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Right. I mean, most societies have always had both explicit ancestor worship, the reverence, the feeding of them, the pouring of wine, the offerings, the reflecting, the praying, the beseeching, right? It's really only in the developed West in the 20th and especially, late, second half of the 20th century into this century, where we've become such fragmented, rational, individual consumer identities. So it's almost like we're potted plants. Like you might go to the gardening store and you see a ficus or whatever it would be, and they're wrapped in a plastic tub, and their root ball can't reach into the earth, and they have to have artificial nutrients and artificial light and watering by watering can. And that's kind of us these days. Friend and speaker of Harvest, Louis Schwartzberg, demonstrated in his beautiful documentary, Fantastic Fungi, right? The idea that not only do we put down our roots into the earth, but then we're connected with these mycelial networks. Mm-hmm. And, in the old growth redwood trees in California, for instance, right? The trees that are high up on a ridgeline and far away from the creek, the big trees down at the bottom, right, shunt water uphill to their thirsty cousins. And when a tree is born without, it's basically a genetic mutation, they're albino, they can't conduct photosynthesis, which is kind of game over for a plant, right? If you can't do it. And it lives because all the other trees in that grove will actually conduct photosynthesis for it and feed it nutrients. And then when a pest or a fungus attacks one of the trees in the forest, it sends out the signals and all the others develop antibodies. So they protect each other. And you think, okay, that's gorgeous, right? It's not just a tree, a single individual isolated. It is, we take our stand in a stand, right? In connection, in relation. And so just to acknowledge, and in fact, Surgeon General Vivek Murthy in the United States just released a big report. He's written on this in the past as well, but just the loneliness epidemic. If you are lonely and isolated in your life, it's the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes every day.
Really?
On health outcomes.
You can measure that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So you're like, okay, so a key part of how do we get to radical hope, a key part of how do we balance the overwhelm of the tragic, right, of this polycrisis, of endless doom scrolling, of it doesn't seem like there's any way out, is to connect to each other. And connecting to each other in community is fantastic. And also intergenerationally, right? Because if I'm doing things on behalf of my children and their children and their children, right? Then you get this beautiful buffering of how do I evaluate how I'm doing? Because if I'm just an isolated individual who's been, conditioned as a consumer, right? For our entire lives, we've been programmed to believe that every itch, every scratch, every possible dream, or inclination deserves and should be met now. I, me, mine, now is how we've been raised, instead of sort of us, we, forever. And if you think of any diaspora peoples, any people who have been, pushed out of their homelands, whether that's the Kurds or it's the Roma or it's the Uyghurs or it's the Tibetans or it's all of the First Nation peoples of North and South America or Africa, you're like, okay, how did they do it? How did they keep some kind of cultural integrity intact through all of those times? Because, the hard challenge is that even the countries that were on the sort of on the pointy end of colonialism, aka mostly sort of Western Europe and the United States, it's coming around for them too, right? And how do we maintain optimism across decades and even centuries? Feels like a really, really essential social sort of technology, inoculation against acute instability. Because if we lose hope, if we forget sort of, if we take our eyes off the prize, right? If we forget what it's in service of, then we're not built for this shit, is kind of the sort of simple answer. We're sort of deconditioned zoo animals at this point. We don't have much backbone. We don't have much grit or perseverance. We don't have much versatility. We've offloaded everything to our smartphones that have made us dumb. Even the shrinking of our hippocampus, because we all rely on Google Maps. And my kids still to this day punch in the digits to navigate our hometown. And I'm like, what the hell are you doing? Right? And those things go away. And we have atrophied all of those skills. You can see that with AI and ChatGPT. And on the hype side of that conversation, Tristan Harris will be speaking about the consequences and the concerns of it. But on the hype side, everybody's like, look at all the amazing things it can do, and it can save your time, and you can write papers, and you can do this and that and the other, and it'll do research for you, and it'll plan. It's like, yes, and, right? We will be atrophying all of our capacities that seem so gee whiz to have a bot do for us. So long story short is to say that the way, that's all the pre-tragic stuff. Everything's going to work out. And it's a sort of techno-utopianism, right? Then you get into the doom scrolling, you get into the poly crisis, and people are like, fucking hell, nothing's going to work out. But we can't stop there, right? Because then it will become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So even if it's slim odds that there are clean, equitable, joyful ways through, we have to at least keep open that sort of 10% possibility of sort of leaving space for grace, right? Leaving space for the emergent, leaving space for the better angels of our nature, leaving space for, right? I mean, this is Winston Churchill in World War II, the sort of never, ever, ever give up. And that is arguably what radical hope is the capacity to, again, be ruthlessly realistic about short to medium term realities and possibilities while remaining relentlessly optimistic about long-term possibility. And again, I don't think that any single one of us is capable of managing that, is capable of buffering that. The only way we do it is in connection to who came before us, our ancestors, who is coming after us, our descendants, and who is around us, right? Our chosen family or community.
Which civilizations are we going to be the ancestors of, you hope?
Which civilizations will we be the ancestors of? That is fascinating. I mean, if I could just hope, if I just get to pick one, make one. I wanted to
ask you, you think, but it's going to be hard for you to know which civilizations are going to be the ancestors of. But so,
I mean, honestly, I do think that if you look at the sort of postmodern, complete, delightful, chaotic mashup that is Burning Man culture, where, you have 80,000 people at any one time gathering together. You have, there are times where it looks like 5th century BC, Bedouin, Hebrew desert. And you're like, whoa, this looks like ancient. And there's other times it looks alien galactic spaceship. And you have the signs and symbols of Western consumer culture tweaked, subverted, played with, in a sort of Dadaist, sort of punk rock comic style. And then you have utterly profound rituals and ceremonies, and plenty that don't even look like that. My hope would be something along those lines. It's a little bit how, Pixar and DreamWorks, like the Shrek films and, and all of the Pixar films, yes, they're still doing kids cartoons, but they're all nodding and winking, and they're all sending up the earlier forms. So, like where Shrek was like all the fairy tales all together. And then you get to tell a new, funny, quirky, subversive story on top of the existing memes of Disney and that kind of thing. I mean, I think that's kind of where we're heading. We're sort of heading to a place where it's a sort of polyglot, multi-ethnic, postmodern mashup of the future rustic. And that would be, to me, pretty fun if we could pull it off.
Fantastic. Two eminent figures of the Tibetan Buddhism join us, Septen Jinpa and Bob Thurman. You mentioned the Tibetan diaspora. What can we learn from them and compassion?
Yeah, I mean, that's a wonderful question. And that's one that Bob and I have been talking about. So I'm excited to hear what he has to say on stage. For me, and my wife and I, Julie, spent time in Tibet guiding in the mid-90s. So we got to see it at a time when it was, relatively speaking, closer to the 50s and pre-Chinese invasion that it is now, for sure, while also seeing all the changes and the impacts of that invasion. I think it's a dialectic is the simple answer, right? The idea of violent resistance versus nonviolent resistance. Most of the world thinks of the Dalai Lama. They think of the sort of the endless, joyful compassion that he represents and embodies so beautifully. And maybe just sort of check that box, like, oh, Tibetans are just shiny, happy people and nothing seems to bother them. And that's not true at all. The Khampas, right, the sort of, basically they were like the Lakota warriors of the Tibetan plateau. So they were a nomadic tribe, raiders and traders, fierce warriors, and they mounted a sustained counterinsurgency against the Chinese invasion. And Bob was clarifying that, in fact, Buddhism is not just turn the other cheek until you're ground into the dirt. There is actually a path for active and even violent resistance as needed in order to be able to protect oneself. And those guys got, both spirited away to Colorado and trained at the 10th Mountain Division by the CIA, and then also left and hung out to dry when Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger did the ping pong diplomacy with China. And even to the point of Kissinger turning over coordinates where all their camps were in Nepal. So that is a lesser known story of the Tibetan diaspora that I think is important just to ground in the history and the nitty gritty reality of it. In fact, it was one of the largest intelligence coups of the entire Cold War. So with all the spy versus spy stuff that was going on, the Tibetan Compass attacked a Chinese supply chain, found what was called, I think, the pink dossier. They found a satchel full of documents, and it was basically just huge amounts of details on how badly China was doing and how much they were suffering and how they had no food and the sort of unrest in the people. And it was one of the largest intelligence coups that the West ever got. And yet, right, the West then absolutely hung them out to dry, and they were brutally shut down. And even more recently, in the last decade, there have been over 100, and by now, I mean, I haven't checked the data lately, but it's probably up to 150 or more of monks and nuns, Tibetans, who have self-immolated, who have set themselves on fire in nonviolent protest as to what is happening to their people. And so I think just to sort of not simply just airbrush it and just say, yay, compassion, nonviolence, Buddha, love, groovy, and he's got it. Right, is to say this is a very thorny, sticky issue, and there are always in any given social justice movement, there are those who advocate the long game, like the Dalai Lama, turning the other cheek, nonviolence, and those who say we can't just keep doing that forever. So Martin Luther King, right, with his kind of Christian charity, forgiveness, nonviolence, which he was inspired by Gandhi's Satyagraha concept. There was Huey Newton and Malcolm X, then the Black Panthers, and just saying enough's enough. Even back to those 19th century Indians, the Lakota, there was Crazy Horse, the warrior, and Sitting Bull, the chief. And there's always going to be, and should be, I think, that tension between how do we manage the forces of change, including injustice and potentially even evil? Okay. Right? And do we do it by sort of sticking to our highest ideals, or are there times where might cannot make right, and you have to meet force with force? And I think that is increasingly true around the world. And so I would think that rather than coming up with a simple answer as to what lessons can we draw, it's messy, it's complicated, it is tragic, it is confounding, and there are still seeds of hope. There are still, moments of inspiration. And just even that passage of Satyagraha, right? I mean, Howard Thurman was a black civil rights theologian predominantly, and he advised Martin Luther King. He advised they were the young bucks, right? And he was teaching at Boston University. He went in the 30s to India, and he met with Gandhi, and Gandhi was sharing Satyagraha, basically the sort of alignment of truth. And he's like, okay, sounds good. That's a mouthful. I'm going to rebrand this. I'm going to call it Soul Force. Let's make this something that's going to work for my people. And he came back to Martin, who was studying at the BU seminary at the time, I think getting his doctorate. And he's like, look, here's the deal. This has power to it. And at the time, in the early civil rights movement, nonviolence was just a tactic. It was just, we're going to march. Kids, don't say anything sassy. Keep your heads down. Our goal is to march, get media, whatever. And if you resist, they're going to, the cops, the Southern cops in particular, will beat you with clubs and sick the dogs on you. So just keep your heads down. After Howard Thurman went to India and took Gandhi's inspiration, then they were like, oh no, this is a central philosophy. We are effectively going to shame the world into paying attention to what we're doing by being impeccable, right, in how we carry ourselves. And then Erica Chenoweth, more recently in the last decade, has been at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. And she's done studies on this and has realized that, in fact, nonviolent protest, and basically she was studying sort of post-World War II social and political change efforts across the world, I think like 36 different countries or instances. And she found that nonviolent protests are twice as effective as violent ones. And then she also found that the tipping point for meaningful cascade of social change and changes in laws and legislation and that kind of thing was as little as 3.5% of a population. Now, and that became a rallying cry for Extinction Rebellion and a lot of the kind of the recent climate protest movements. I do think there's legit, I just suppose, nuance, because it's one thing if you're Rosa Parks and you're in the American civil rights movement and you're saying, hey, I don't want to sit on the back of the bus. Right? Mm-hmm. But the bus has air in the tires and petrol in the tank. That's a fairly straightforward, that's a more straightforward move. Like, here's a functioning civil society. I just insist on having my rightful place in it. Yeah. We're at a point right now where the sort of bus is hurtling off a cliff on fire. And we're hoping that it turns into chitty chitty bang bang, before we hit the bottom. So whether or not we need, I don't know, like the 3.5% was a specific, studies on a specific time period, the post-World War II era. Where we are now, who knows? But I think it's unlikely to be less than 3.5%. And since we're not at 3.5%, let's shoot for it. And then let's reassess if and when we get there.
Thank you so much. What do you want to come back with after this harvest?
Well, I mean, I think especially in sort of putting, collaborating with Roman and Barak and the entire Harvest team, just the joy, the hope, the satisfaction of seeing people dive into this content and actually work with it. Again, not as an audience, but as participants, and to see people having the conversations and coming to the insights and drawing their own conclusions and walking out of here with their heads high and their hearts open to engage the world with increased commitment and dedication. And I always think of MacArthur Fellow Wendell Berry. He's a sort of a profound philosopher and poet and advocate for agrarian society in the United States. And he has a line in one of his poems that says, "Be joyful, though you have considered all the facts."
Do you talked about people drawing their own conclusion. That's a question I wanted to ask you. Do you want to take people to a certain place to influence them with a good intention?
No, I think if anything, I mean, on a nerdy level, like what are we doing at the level of instructional design of this event? It is constructivist action learning, developmentally informed constructivist action learning, right? Which is, so the developmentally informed is we are attempting to help you expand your capacity to make better sense of things. Constructivist, and you're going to do it for yourself. And the action learning is, roll up your sleeves and get dirty. Let's actually kick this stuff around. So rather than it being received didactic information, we're going to tell you what to think. Actually helping people think more deeply, more expansively, more creatively, for themselves. So it's not that we have any perspective, I don't think, really, on what conclusions that people should draw. But we do have a perspective that a more considered conclusion is going to be generally better than a less considered conclusion. And just to create the situations and the collisions and the conditions and the serendipity where people have more of those better considered, more inspired conclusions.
Jamie, it's the last question. This year, it's the harvest of the day is if there is one thing that gives you hope, what is it?
I would say I've kind of set aside running the numbers on human-based solutions. I kind of think our human nature is going to do what human nature is going to do at this point. But I am constantly amazed at nature's regenerative capacity. If we just stop fucking it up, even for a moment, life returns, beauty comes back. And so my sense, for me at least, is I feel a sort of visceral or palpable transition from actively seeking solutions and ways through to deep appreciation of every beautiful moment that still is. And there's a bit of sort of like hillbilly wisdom. There was a book, but then a Disney film that most people saw called Old Yeller. And it was about this Labrador dog in Texas during the settlement days, and he defends the family, and then he gets bitten by a rabid coyote or a wolf, and the dog dies, and it made our kids very sad when we listened to it on books on tape when we were driving. What did you make us do? We really like this guy. So yeah, sad story, dog dies. The horses always die and the dogs always die. The kids twigged onto that at some point. But the dad is sitting there with this, broken-hearted son, and he's sitting there on the on his rocking chair on the front porch, and he's like, "Son, near as I can figure, about half this life is good parts, and about half this life is bad parts. But if you spend all the good parts worrying about all the bad parts, why, then it's all bad."
Thank you so much for being here and for co-curating this 7 seasons of Harvest series. Thank you so much.
You are welcome.
Thank you for watching this episode of Harvest series. I hope you enjoyed this interview. If you want to hear more, you can click on the subscribe button, and I hope to see you soon for our next interview.